Welcome to Freedom Becomes You. This is the website and the podcast where we talk about the intersections between science, psychology, and mind-body practice. And today I'm delighted to be joined for a second time by the one and only Jules Mitchell. Hi.
Hi.
How's it going today, Jules?
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation last time. Thoroughly enjoyed the workshop I took with you on the science of stretching. And I know that you're in the midst of a demanding teaching schedule and you're doing a lot of writing. I would love to just check in with you as a sort of follow-on from our conversation last time on what you're thinking about, what you're sharing in the world right now. I know that the overlap where you and I have kind of common interests have to do with yoga and science, essentially.
Yeah. Gosh, where am I in things? I submitted the manuscript for my book about a month ago, and it turned out to have 150 references, which was not my intention.
Yeah.
I was thinking to do a little bit more like free writing. It was just so labor intensive.
Wow.
I guess that just shows that I just can't get away from the importance of research, right?
Yeah, so it ends up being more of an academic document than you expected.
It is a little academic.
Yeah.
And what I'm kind of like living into with, academics and science is this idea of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm finding like there's a lot of pushback, from more mainstream, entities, because people don't like uncertainty.
Wait, now hold on. When you say mainstream, do you mean mainstream science or mainstream yoga?
Mainstream yoga.
Gotcha. Okay.
There's just, there's a lot of, how should we do it? How is it supposed to be done? And I'm like, well, those answers don't exist in the science, so I don't have one. Of frustration. I think it's just, right now in my life, what's around me is getting really really comfortable with uncertainty and help other people get comfortable with it because they're not. So.
That's so interesting. I was just out walking my dog, as you know, and I was thinking about our conversation, and I'm in the midst of several different interviews with people who were kind of sort of playfully and loosely referring to it as a kind of yoga renaissance, where there's this examining through a more scientific lens the way we teach asana. Mm-hmm. And I was walking with him and I was thinking, there's a piece of this that at some point really has to be addressed and unpacked, which is how cognitively and psychologically overwhelming it can be to step into that uncertainty and to recognize that the reference points that we've always had, which were kind of just handed down in an authoritarian way, may not actually be true, or they may be partially true, or they may be in a process of evolving discovery, which I think is really the spirit of scientific inquiry. Mm-hmm. But that is innately kind of threatening if you've really invested yourself and become identified with certain ideas of alignment and the right way to do things.
Absolutely.
And for me, a kind of orthopedic, anatomical, somewhat outdated model that I was educated in about, structural muscles and how to correct various things and how yoga poses could be used in that way. So anyway, I don't want to talk over you, but that's what brings up for me.
Those things that we were all educated in and that are still used as general education in many different programs still going on. So that's kind of the real challenge with it. It's not that this, I think you said the word, outdated model. It's not even outdated in the sense that it's actually very, very, very current.
Yes.
It's happening everywhere. My sister right now is studying for like she wants to be a Zumba teacher. She's like tired of working in technology. And so she just wants to she's already been Zumba certified, but she wants to get like through an organization, don't need to name it, doesn't matter, but an organization like a personal training or group X cert, so she can get insurance and do that, jump through the hoops. And I'm looking at her text and I'm like, oh my God, this is like still like it's a modern text testing with, it's the current version, current edition, and it's still kind of perpetuating. So it's not like, when you were saying people are invested in this, it's actually, to a lot of people, it's still new, what they think current information, because the systems haven't been updated yet either.
Gotcha.
So that puts those of us on the fringes even at a greater disadvantage, because now we're not going, oh, that's 20 years old, competing with things that are being taught today.
Okay, yeah. So it's not so much even that you learned that 10 or 20 years ago, it's that you learned that last week.
Yeah.
And now you're coming to my workshop and I'm sort of maybe challenging that or contradicting it.
Yeah, you learned it yesterday from your teacher, and it's standard protocol, standard education in a lot of different places still. And so that makes it even harder, because it's like, well, I don't know. Could it be something else? And people don't like that because they just memorized it for their test,
Yeah, so it sounds like a twofold sort of hurdle that you have to jump over. One is, okay, here's this information that might contradict some other things that you've learned from authority figures. And then I'm not going to now be the new authority figure who says, this is actually the correct way to do it, and this is how you upgrade your teaching. Today, just here, we can just write down some points, and now this will be the right way to do it, because you're saying, well, actually, we don't know.
Yep.
So what good is all of this, Jules Mitchell?
I don't know. I think that question is the next thing that comes up. Is like, well, then this sense of frustration and not knowing, then the result is then that people want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater and be like, well, then what's the point of it all? Well, that's also that's like the extreme, like, hold on. It's still yoga. There's still room for inquiry. There's still room for some of the older lessons, just maybe placed in a different context instead of this binary correct, incorrect. What happens if you do it this way? And can you do it this way? And how does it work? And are there options? And that's also, I think, tough for people, because now they're still using old language, but trying to make it work in a new way, like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also the other frustrating answer, which I think is very, actually an appropriate answer, is it depends, right? It's like, well, what are the qualifiers on the question? And who are we talking about?
Yeah. Talking about what are the goals, like, what else is going on, in the environment. Yeah, there's a lot of questions.
Wow.
Always.
Yeah. So I'm curious, in terms of just where you're at with your work right now. Are there a couple kind of key ideas that you keep coming back to that sort of represent things that you've discovered, or questions that you really have become curious about?
One of the things I'm kind of talking about is this kind of idea of injury, and, yoga causing injury or not, and kind of how we navigate through that. So a couple things, like, what is an injury? First of all, that's, with what we know about pain science, that really challenges what we traditionally thought of as an injury. And then also, I think, in that same vein, it's kind of become this buzz to say, oh, there's no movement is inherently bad. And I think I agree with that notion, but I think it's being thrown around a little bit too casually. It's like, yes, I've said it myself, but it's kind of a lot of things I feel like I've said that I held very dearly and revealed with a lot of context, end up being kind of thrown around casually, and the context is lost, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's kind of hot for me right now, that idea of, all movement is good. It's just if you're prepared. And I agree with that. You should need to be prepared. But some movements for some people aren't necessary. Context is extremely important. Again, like, what are the person's goals? What do they need to do? What are any sort of pre-existing contraindications for whatever reason?
Yeah.
A level of caution is still good. Is still a good thing to impose, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. So say, what was the first thing again? Because I was thinking about the all movement is good, and the first one was what is an injury?
Yeah.
And there's a whole piece in there that I know you're really fascinated about, which is pain science and a kind of a biopsychosocial model. That perhaps injury is not so neatly reducible to a kind of anatomical dynamic, right?
So, like, I was just in the anatomy lab last week, and one of the cadavers had a titanium knee, so had a full knee replacement. And so I just had spent some time thinking, like, I don't know what the cause of the knee replacement was, maybe, cartilage degeneration, so osteoarthritis or something. How can a knee with some tissue, damage or some tissue degeneration, that with like something like osteoarthritis, we know that some days osteoarthritis is more painful than others. So there's other factors at play other than just the cartilage degeneration.
Yeah.
So we have good days and bad days. It's cartilage isn't regenerating and degenerating constantly, so there's other factors involved. So how can a knee with, I don't know, a perceived sense of maybe instability or a perceived sense of failure or something, mechanical failure, how can that be so painful? And then we can hammer a titanium plate through the femur bone onto the knee, and then hammer a titanium plate with some silicone on it as the socket. And then the patella was also, artificial. So how can we now open up a body, put in these artificial materials? It's quite invasive, like to start alone, but also, to plate the knee, there's it is bound to that femur. And how do we come out of surgery and say, oh, that feels so much better? Like, what is happening in the brain that a little bit of tissue damage is miserable and so painful, and then there's huge relief from some total invasion of, it's blowing my mind. I don't have an answer. I kind of was discussing it with some of my table mates, but how does that happen?
Yep. That is really, really interesting, right? Because I always think with these kinds of surgical interventions, there's a gothic quality to it, right? It's like, you did what? And that was the solution? Wow.
But they're successful. Yeah. So I'm more interested in what's going on there, and what is it that we can do? I'm not against the surgery. It's not that. It's just like, you can't even fathom that is better than a little bit of degenerated cartilage, or a lot. I don't want to belittle that with language, a lot, but that some people can. How can some people have arthritis and not have pain, and others have pain? It's just the complexity of the system and how the system processes, tissue damage in the knee. It just blows my mind. I can't wrap my head around it.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at today. When you catch me right after,
absolutely,
just in awe. I just can't believe it. We're full of wonder right now.
Yeah, and this is I think it's so related to where we started, because your passion for continuing to engage and stay with the deeply perplexing questions, I think, is really apparent. Yeah. How does this work?
And why? And why is it not the same in every person? Why does one person get the surgery and they don't recover? It's just it's just too much.
Yeah. I hear you. Yeah. So in terms of the teaching and writing sort of intensive period that you're in right now, and you started the whole thing off by saying you keep encountering some pushback from a more sort of mainstream yoga perspective. If there was one thing that you were able to say in this moment where, you know, you're not having to deal with the bombardment of people's confusion or resistance, what would you want to say to perhaps the yoga community in general about how we might interact with some of these ideas, some of this information?
You know, like my theme has been going, like, as a teacher, to spend a lot less time instructing.
Okay.
Especially in yoga. You know, we're just moving body weight around. It's not like we're, you know, things get complicated when we start adding, you know, barbells and you know, heavy weights, and when load, it really increases. But when we're doing body weight stuff, to spend a little bit of less time in instructing and teaching and cueing, and spend a little bit more time looking and learning. You know, I think we get so prepared to teach a class that we were given this script, and then somewhere along the line it becomes easy, and we don't like look at the students and see how they respond. We just look at those that don't respond the way we expected them to. And it's not about how they should respond, it's about how are they responding. So there's this deep level of inquiry as a teacher that I think can help process this kind of pushback against research and questioning and the script and the cueing. And that is to not to like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Teach your class with your cues, but maybe replace one cue with a question instead. You know, look and see. Like, if you don't tell, here's an example. If you don't tell your students to externally rotate their arms when they go from plank to downward dog, if you don't tell them that, right? How do they do downward dog? Like, will the system figure it out? And will you see 20 different strategies of downward dog? And does that strategy show up when they do a different pose where arms are overhead? And like, you know, like, can you learn from the students, and can you just ask them like what's happening, what they feel in their arms? Because, you know, not everybody does it the same, and not everybody has the same morphology, and not everybody, some people have an injury, or some, you know, they're working around it and they prefer to do it this way. Or, like, there's not one right way for the arms to be in downward dog. And sometimes I think we're like, well, this is how I learned it. It's supposed to look like this. So say less and ask more, and look. And that's how we can learn, when we start seeing all these different shoulders in downward dog is like full, not faulty. I don't know if that was a good example or not.
I love it. Yeah. I mean, I really hear you talking about a kind of curious humility where you are paying attention to the variety of anatomical and biomechanical expression as it shows up in the space, as opposed to thinking that in order to be a legitimate teacher, you have to get everyone to do it in one particular way. There's more of a curiosity about, go ahead.
I was going to give another example to drive it home. I was leading a training, and we were basically elevating our arms overhead, you know, going into shoulder flexion. And I was kind of cueing some co-contractions, so supporting the joint with all of the musculature around it. And one of the women in the class was like, oh, that's kind of like giving me a pinchy feeling. And I said, well, why don't you elevate your scapula a little bit? And she was like, oh, that's much better. And she was like, I can do that? You know, and I was like, oh, because she had for 10 years been told shoulders down, shoulders down, shoulders down. And I was like, yeah, you can do that. Like, what difference does it make? Because we buy into the myth that this is the only stable place for the shoulders. I'm like, her arms are going overhead. When she's holding a foam block, like, what does she, it was so unbelievable. And I was like, you know, maybe if you do it this way for a while, you can come back and try it with your shoulders down, and it won't be uncomfortable. But it doesn't even matter. Like, you know, and it was this sense of freedom that she got, because she'd been trying to like please the status quo. You know, like, I understand yoga. I learned how to do it this way. This is how I'm going to do it. Even if it pinches my shoulder and I hate it, I'm still going to do it this way. till she got permission not to. And it was like, it wasn't even anything drastic. It was just such a simple thing. And it makes me sad that we're not invited to be like, well, I don't like that for me. I'm going to try it this way and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this culture of what it means to be a good student.
Yeah.
And that you're striving to look a certain way and to always do things in a certain way, even if it doesn't feel good.
Yep.
Wow. Well, it's so interesting. I mean, I imagine anyone who's listening might have a hard time kind of wrapping their head around. On the one hand, you're talking about a more rigorous approach to research and understanding or inquiring into what's happening with the body through the lens of certain kinds of yoga movements. And on the other hand, I'm hearing a very open-ended, permissive attitude that says, well, let's see, and how does that feel? And, well, what if you try it this way? And for you, that works.
But so I guess it's, yes, people might have trouble with that. But if you start looking at the research that I'm, interested in, it's... we started this call talking about this sort of model that is of education that is carried through. Well, that shows up in the research too. So you'll get these papers that will look at like a yoga pose, for example, and it will tell you what muscles are being activated in different poses. So what? It's like the conclusions that then are made. So they use EMG and they're like, oh, Warrior 2 had a lot of adductor. We expected it to be abductor and it had a lot of adductor. This is useful in blah, 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 blah rehab. I don't know where you made that conclusion. Like it tells, it doesn't, like, there's nothing that supports that this is like, I don't know. I feel like it's this huge leap. And like the research has to be approached with sort of the same inquiry. For example, one paper on yoga, it was the yoga biomechanics paper. They were looking at like lower limb muscle activation in different poses and found that one-legged poses, like half moon, like balancing on one leg, had greater lower leg muscle activation than some of the other poses. Therefore, it might be useful in like gait retraining rehab. And how though? Like, wouldn't you, if somebody were going to do some gait retraining, wouldn't you just want to do gait retraining?
Yes.
So the question is, where I would like to see research go is like, does half moon retrain gait? These are the muscles that are activated in half moon. These are the muscles that are activated in gait. Therefore, they could potentially be good for each other. I think that's a huge leap. I think and then also like, does gait need to be retrained? That's another. So the questions, it's just interesting when you go into the research and you can see what researchers have different, frame of minds and what they're looking for and the conclusions that are being made. So I don't read a paper and say, oh, here's my answer. I read a paper and I question it just like I question how somebody does downward dog.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing you say is that there's an in-between step that is taken as obvious because the model within which they're posing the questions already assumes that these muscles need to be corrected in these ways to address this issue. And we see that they get activated by half moon, therefore. Yes,
exactly. And nothing like there's no fault being assigned or anything. I mean, this is the model in which all of this exists.
Yes.
I was so blessed that when I was a graduate student, my thesis advisor, like she did not put me in a box. I've heard completely different stories. She was like, you want to study this? Go for it. And she pushed me into the research. It was awful. It was terrible because I was constantly confronted. I didn't get this model in which to validate previously made conclusions. I was given like this ocean of create your own hypothesis, and it was horrible, but so worth it. Really taught me to think differently. And so I think that's kind of let's not just question the research, let's question the model itself. And I think that is where it gets exciting. And that's where we get to have conversations like this. Yes. None of us know. I could be totally wrong. The model could be like the answer, you know, but I'm not convinced. And until I'm convinced, I'm going to keep asking.
Yeah, it raises so many interesting questions for me about the relationships between, you know, about how we discover and interpret and communicate knowledge, right? And how one aspect of the scientific method is that we're building on what has been discovered before. And there's something I think that is still valid about saying, okay, well, we're continuing to learn more. We're continuing to address questions based on what we feel we've already addressed. But there's another piece of it, which is that as we continue looking into what we don't know, we discover things that question or challenge some of what we thought we did already know. And where that line is between a kind of really unreasonable skepticism that just says, well, you can't know anything, right? Which is and I find a lot of people in spiritual circles tend to go that direction, like, well, nothing is really knowable. Anything is completely possible. It could be that you got better because you turned 3 times in a circle and touched the wall in this particular place, right? We don't know. So there's that level of, I think, really unreasonable skepticism. And then there's, on the other side of the line, a very healthy skepticism that really gets sort of specific about the questions that were, or about the established ideas that we're questioning for specific reasons, right?
Yeah. Agreed.
So I'm curious about that. When you, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but when you look at a study like that and you say, well, there's a leap that's being made based on the unexamined assumptions of the model within which the researcher is thinking.
Yep.
Are there 1 or 2 specific questions about that model that you feel are not being asked in that case that would lead them to not make that leap?
Rephrase that. Are there questions?
So, for example, you referenced a couple different studies where the leap was being made, right? So maybe lower leg activation is happening more in this pose than in that pose. So therefore, we imagine this pose might be good for gait retraining.
Yeah.
What, in terms of the leap that they're making, what's the question that you feel is being overlooked?
I would like to just kind of a lot of that research. I'd just like to kind of see reporting of it. You know, this is what we've got, and then the questions. I think I kind of mentioned them earlier. Would be like more like applicable, like so if it were determined that somebody was going to get gait retraining, do these poses actually make a difference regardless of what muscles are being activated? Okay. Does that make sense? Like more of an application that would be really interesting to see. And you know, and maybe we need to document which muscles are being activated first before, so we can get validation to get a study approved on the next step, you know, so that's possible.
Yeah.
I would also like to, you know, I mean, this whole question of like, does gait need to be retrained? Like, is there faulty gait? Is there optimal gait? These are also really interesting questions. Of course, if you dive into the gait research, you're going to see, you know, half of it says, no, it's not necessary. And the other half says it is necessary. Okay. Again, depending on the model from which. Yeah. So you kind of have to pick a side and then, you know, kind of stick with it while at the same time being up, you know, staying up to date with the other side and challenging your own bias constantly. But those are some of the questions that I'd like to see, because that's what's missing in yoga. Okay. So a lot of that research is available in, you know, in the world of rehab and in the world of, you know, even sports science. But a lot of it's not done on yoga. And so, you know, we have some really, like, all of the early biomechanical research on yoga is fantastic because we don't have any. So like it doesn't tell us anything yet. It's like one study on Warrior 2 or one study on tree pose. It's amazing because we actually have some information. Does it warrant these massive conclusions that people want to make from them? Not even the researchers. I mean, they just kind of hint at little things, but sometimes, you know, it gets put into a blog and then it's like, well, this is how you should do the pose. And it's like, well, it's just one paper, just reporting a little bit of data. We can't just automatically say that, you know, it's like it's a starting point. That's what's good about it, not that these conclusions are valid.
So the science is in now. We have one study.
Yeah, exactly. We have one study on a specific population. You know, like it doesn't help. You know, it doesn't. And a lot of the yoga that is being studied does not resemble like studio culture. You know, I mean, it's like very, of course, because it has to be very controlled. And but you know, like I'd also like to see, rather than just a random pose being done, you know, I'd like to kind of see what happens throughout a entire class, because that's really how are most people accessing yoga. You know, they're going to classes.
Yeah.
So you know,
they're not doing Warrior 2 for 5 minutes, 3 days a week and reporting the results.
Yeah. Exactly. And then seeing how it affects how they walk. You know, like that's not what's happening.
Yeah.
So,
I'm curious, just because I've been having a few interesting conversations about this lately, and you know, feel free to answer it or not, but I'm curious about your current feelings about the concept that I know has sort of been central to how we've thought about yoga and how we've trained yoga teachers, the concept of alignment.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on it?
Whose alignment?
There's the it depends answer, I guess.
I don't even know what alignment means, to be honest. Like I think I did this in one of my online courses, Beyond Yoga Alignment. I really broke down the definition of the term. It's like, you know, how parts are related to each other, you know. Like how did that like Webster definition become this, like, you know, model of this plumb line, you know, the head has to be right over the shoulders. Like I just don't, that doesn't even, like, I can't even fathom that. So I you know, are we looking at alignment in terms of like postural perfection? Are we just looking at alignment as relationship of parts? Like this is where, you know, this is where the philosophy comes in. Like we need to like pick these words apart at the most basic level in order to even know what we're talking about. So I just try not to use the word, really. I mean, I did sell an online course called Beyond Yoga Alignment, but to have that conversation.
Yes, absolutely.
Not to say this is good alignment or bad alignment, or you know, anytime someone says, you know, in order to protect your fill in the blank, you know, knee, spine, back, neck, whatever, do it this way. I dare you to watch an Olympic video and find an athlete not doing it that way. I dare you. Because it'll come up, you know, like the minute somebody says, and this came up actually in my course, I was challenging knee over the ankle, you know.
That's the example.
Looking at some different research. And after the course, a woman emailed me a Instagram photo of Serena Williams, like with her knees totally caving in, you know, for the serve. And, you know, and it was like, perfect, great example. So in order to protect your knee, keep it over the ankle. Yeah, we've got, you know, Serena Williams, like, who's like a mega human being, you know, a superhero, you know, that is like, it's just like, hey, you know, there are times when alignment is less important than, you know, performance and skill and all these other things, you know. So,
I mean,
you know, the yoga alignment is rooted in this weird Euclidean geometry, right angles, you know, like moving in certain planes. And I just don't think the body moves that way. The body doesn't know Euclidean geometry. You know, it's not, we're too complex.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with all of that and with the history of it and with the kind of, you know, the sociological, philosophical kind of layers of this, because I feel like as a community we've latched onto this idea of alignment in an authoritative way, that somehow there's this thing called alignment and it comes from this ancient tradition, and if you do everything with these things lined up in this particular kind of straight line geometrical aesthetic, then you will prevent injury, then you will do the poses correctly, even so far as to say then you will attain sort of the inner promise of what this practice is about. And looking back at it, you know, if you look at Krishnamacharya, you look at photographs of Krishnamacharya, he has the kind of alignment that if you did a YogaWorks teacher training, you'd be correcting him all day long. No, that's wrong. Turn your foot this way, angle this way, lift up, go get longer here, right? And then you see Iyengar, and I really feel like Iyengar, most likely, this is pure speculation, just because of his own temperament, got really focused on straight lines and really focused on these medicalized claims that I don't think were really based on anything about how what the benefits of each of these poses were. And I think there was something about the visual representation of the straight line, the cleanness of those straight lines aesthetically, that was part of trying to convince people that there was a really like legitimate authoritative sort of thing being conveyed here. And I think we've all bought into that. And it got really big in the 90s. I think there were a few really big teacher trainings that trained a lot of teachers that talked about alignment in this way. And the more I get curious about the kinds of questions we're discussing and about how the body is actually shaped and how joints actually move, it's like, well, where are these straight lines? And why are these straight lines important? And you used Serena Williams as an example. I mean, look at powerlifters. You know, look at people who are lifting like twice their body weight and they're already huge up from a squat where their knee is in completely like extreme flexion, like way out over their toes. Yeah.
I know. That's what I mean. If you're ever wanting to challenge your own knowledge of alignment, just watch some pro athletes. They'll blow your mind, you know? And then I always get the like, oh, but they're pro athletes, they can handle more. Or, oh, but they're pro athletes, they're ruining their bodies, you know? And I'm like, well, it's not the position that's ruining their body. It's not the alignment. It's the massive training loads that's ruining their body. So like, let's put this into context. Like, it's not that Serena Williams' knee is caving in and this, it's just maybe she will retire early because she's, you know, training at huge volumes that the average person can't even fathom.
Absolutely.
Not the, you know, there's a greater context.
Absolutely. So repetitive athletes are putting 200,000 miles on their bodies in the space of 10 years.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So how do you, just for the last thing here, how would you loop back around what you were just saying to your kinds of discomfort with all movement is good being tossed around kind of very loosely these days?
I think, you know, it's true that you know, movements aren't inherently bad. I would agree with that. I think where we run into trouble is when we try to fit movement, somebody else's movement into ours. You know what I mean? Where you know, it's not always necessary. You know, like, you know, I work with a lot of seniors with my private clients, and, you know, like, do I need to, you know, do they need to have full maximum rotation of their shoulder in order to lead a happy, healthy life? You know what I mean? Like, we get very idealistic when we start saying all movements are good, you just have to prepare for them. And I love the statement. Like I said, it's not incorrect. It's just, you know, for some people, depending on if they play a sport or what their goals are, or, you know, whatever, they might not need to do a certain movement. And it doesn't need to be so idealistic.
Yes.
You know, I want my clients to like lead happy, healthy lives and live relatively pain-free. You know, I mean, no one's fully pain-free, but relatively. And that means sometimes we do eliminate some movements because they're not necessary, and it does aggravate them, and they don't need to prepare for them because it's that they're not doing those activities anymore. Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. I've been saying in my classes, very, very influenced by you lately, you know, we'll be in certain poses and I'll say, well, you could do it this way, you could do it that way, could do it this way. There are all of these different options, and we need different things based on so many variables, from genetics to biography, to injury and trauma history, to your diet, to your psychology, like the number, to your hobbies, to what you do every day for a living. So for me, I'm sort of trying to put this meme out there that the advanced practice is the one in which you're discovering what's good medicine for you over the course of your life as the variables shift. And it's not about looking a particular way or being able to do specific things. It's more about how at home are you in your body how able are you to access, things like mindfulness and compassion and playfulness and resilience, that this practice is perhaps a vehicle for developing.
Yep. Agreed.
Yeah. Any final statement? Anything? Do you want to tell us anything about the article that you're about to dash off and work on? Give us a preview or no?
No, I'll wait. I'm writing an article on Headstand.
Okay.
A national publication, and I'm going to write a blog about my experience after I consult my attorney. I'm serious. I'm totally serious. That's a good
preview. No, I know you're serious.
So it's been an adventure. Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, nothing bad. And like, but I just don't know, I don't know how these large corporations work. So I just need to protect myself before I use any names or anything. But it's been an interesting process. Okay. I'll let, that'll come out when it comes out. But my book will be out in October. I'll say that. So
what's the book title?
The book title is Yoga Biomechanics, Stretching Redefined.
Lovely.
So it's very educational. It like teaches people what biomechanics is, like what it's, where it's important, where it's not. Has a stretching, like a stretching literature review, and then I it's not about stretching. Like people think it's about flexibility. I totally, at the end of chapter 2, I take the conversation totally away from flexibility and bring it into like tissue adaptation and capacity. So that's why it's stretching redefined. It's like, the tensional network that our body is takes it all away from flexibility. So it's kind of it's unexpected. So
I will look forward to that. That's exciting. How can people find you? What are some opportunities to learn from you in the near future?
Just my website is julesmitchell.com, and I've got a lot of teaching in a lot of different cities. I've got a lot of online courses. I've got a teacher training, a 300-hour teacher training in Las Vegas. I still have room for 2019, and that's very immersive. And I'm working on right now launching kind of a sort of like a mastermind community type thing after teacher training, where we can further the inquiry and have conversations like this. Beautiful. But I don't know how that's going to look yet. Yeah. So it'll be on the website when it's available.
All of that is very exciting. Yay. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I know you're very busy, Jules.
Yeah. Thanks.